How Books Work, Real Talk with editors, agents, and publishing insiders. Hosted by writers Julie Satow and Alice Robb. Eamon Dolan has worked as an editor at HarperCollins, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and Penguin Press. He's currently vice president and executive editor at Simon Schuster. During his 30-year career, he's published virtually every genre except cookbooks. His high watermarks include Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and Joshua Foyer's Moonwalking with Einstein. He's also published fiction by Lisa C., Paul Theroux, and Donna Leon, among others. When he's not editing, Eamon's likely to be writing or shooting. He's a professional photographer whose work has been shown at the International Center of Photography and elsewhere, and he's written a book called The Power of Parting, which will be published in 2025 by Putnam. The Power of Parting draws on his own experience of physical and psychological abuse in childhood, as well as research on trauma and interviews with other survivors like himself to show how survivors can sever ties with abusive relatives to find freedom and peace. Eamon, we're so excited to have you on the show.
What a bio. Wow.
Yeah. Sounds intriguing. Moderate.
Sounds amazing. Very intense. Yeah.
We'll see about that.
But we have lots of questions about like we want to get your view as someone who's like at the top of publishing on. But first, I'm just so curious how it's been writing your own book after so many years of editing other people's books.
It's been, in short, great. I will say I never wanted to write a book. As an editor, I know what a grueling, horrible task book writing is. No matter how much you get paid, it always ends up being roughly minimum wage, given the amount of unanticipated work that goes into it. I've edited easily over 200, probably close to 300 books by now. So I've seen the process up close and personal. So I know how hard it is. And I greatly admire authors as such. To me, they're like ultramarathon runners or climbers of Everest, or something like that. Just an incredibly hard task that most humans can't or shouldn't even try to complete, and they've completed it. So a lot of admiration, but also a lot of not me. I'm going to sit here on this side of the desk. Thank you very much. But the process turned out to be pretty much as grueling as I expected it would be, but cathartic and hope-inducing, and at times even kind of fun. The topic that I'm writing about, that I wrote about, it has darkness in it for sure. But those of us who are survivors of childhood abuse exist largely in isolation. A lot of the survivors I talked to said that I was the first person that they had opened up to about their experiences. Wow. And finding this community was joyful. And I couldn't have found it. There are other ways I couldn't have found it, but I don't think I could have immersed myself in the psyches and hearts of these people if I weren't sharing my story, if they weren't sharing their story as deeply as we were sharing. So it was great.
That's amazing. That's really beautiful. I wonder, what was the process, if you knew how grueling it is, what was that moment when you were like, okay, I want to, jump in the pool. I'm ready to delve in and do this myself. How did that come about?
Well, pardon me. So in my day job, I had been looking for about 3 years for someone to write a book roughly like The Power of Parting. I knew that estrangement could be something dramatically different than how it is portrayed in society at large, and in the other books that I had seen on the topic. There's a narrative that we're sold that estrangement is tragic, and in fact, maybe it should even be avoided. And my experience was it was exactly the opposite. Severing ties with my mom was one of the best three best things I have done in my entire life. And it was so liberating for me. And I really became myself once I estranged from my mother. And I wanted someone else with letters after their name or a great journalistic profile, to write about that, to write about the other side of estrangement. And again, I looked for 3 years. I, searched on Google Scholar. Every time I went out to lunch or drinks with an agent, I would, tell them that this was the book on top of my wish list. And they'd often say, "Oh, that's a great idea. I don't really have anyone on my list for it." And then one day in early 2022, I was out for drinks with my now agent, Todd Schuster, and I made my pitch that I usually make. And he said, he thought for, maybe a second and a half, and he said, "You should write it yourself." He said, "You can't find anyone else to write it." He knew me well. We had worked on several books before. We've known each other actually since probably for 30 years. And I initially, scoffed at the idea. And then over the weekend, I started writing the proposal.
Wow.
That's amazing. So what, I feel like you must be so well equipped because you do know the ins and outs. But actually, interestingly, the reason why Alice and I decided to do this podcast is because we felt like from the writer perspective, the business side of books is so opaque and we kind of have no idea it's like a black box, what you guys do in the publishing houses. And, even though we had both written 2 books, like we were so clueless, how the process worked. So we wanted to interview people like you to try to figure it out. So, it must be so empowering actually to be a writer and to be so immersed in the business side and understand exactly every step and what's happening. Or was it not? What surprised you,
Yeah.
That's a great question. And I agree with the premise of it. I definitely was in an advantageous position relative to other authors by having the day job that I have. I will say that did not, I still felt like I was working somewhat without a net, and that I was depending upon my editor and the other people at Putnam to guide me. First of all, different houses have different processes. The overall process is by necessity the same. You have to, 1, write the book, 2, edit the book, 3, publish the book. But beyond that, everyone has their proclivities, their jargon, and that sort of thing. The processes are different even within different imprints of the same building. So the way we do things at Simon & Schuster is somewhat different than the way they do them at Scribner or Atria. And, those are imprints in in the Simon & Schuster umbrella. So it didn't guarantee me that I would know exactly how everything was going to go, but I understood going into it that that my editor had my back, and that I think that made it easier for me to take chances on the page than I think a lot of authors feel they can, especially first timers. And also as an editor, I know how to put books together. I still needed a lot of wisdom from my editor, Michelle Howry, especially in organizational terms, but the craft of putting sentences together and making sure that transitions work and callbacks and foreshadowing and things like that, I had an advantage because I had been helping other people do that for years. I'm still, I consider myself to be midway through the process. The book is in production, which is in editorial terms, the biggest milestone. But, I still have to figure out how to talk about the thing. What are my sound bites? Getting Alice Robb and Julie Sattler to write cool blurbs, and other people too. So there's still much that I could, guidance that I could use. But I also know going in, roughly when the next beat will come. So I think that I don't have a lot of the angst that authors understandably have throughout the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then how did it work did you like take book leave, or how was how did you juggle such a, big job with also writing your first book?
Well, I think my motto was vacation, schmacation. I basically took no time off.
Wow.
For leisure or pleasure between September 22 and about 2 weeks ago. And I had already banked some vacation, and they let you carry over some of that into the next year at Simon. So I was able to make good use of that time. And I said to myself going in, and I said to my wife, if I'm going to do this, I'm just going to have to work 7 days a week for 2 years or so. And I was able to do it. And I don't want to set myself up as a hero or a martyr. I was able to do it because a lot of people helped me in one way or another, most notably my wife, but also my colleagues at Simon. I didn't take a book leave per se, but I was able to, as I said, bank my vacation and sort of stretch it out so that I could have half days, basically for a couple of months last year when I was in the thick of doing the interviewing and the research. And that, I still acquired books. I skipped some meetings. I basically took afternoons off for 6 or 7 weeks. And that combined with, working through the holidays and that kind of thing, enabled me to pull it off. And I was also lucky, frankly, in terms of how the day job and the side gig, ended up meshing with each other. I had, I carried a full load, editorially, but the projects, that I edited happened to come in with just a little sort of arranging of schedules between me and my authors. They happened to come in during relative lulls in the writing process, so I was really lucky that way. And then also the two jobs are, for me at least, were complementary rather than competitive. Each really felt like a break from the other, researching, writing, all the psychic and practical work of writing a book is different than the work of pitching books or editing books or assessing proposals in a way that made each feel like a bit of a break from the other. And then I was also lucky in that I was, I was able to come home and, I'd try to work for an hour most nights and then give one day of the weekend over to the book and the other day to my day job.
Wow. I would feel so sick of books. Doing that because I just know, like, while I'm working on it, it's hard for me even, like, the only thing I can do is, like, I read sci-fi as like a, as like a way to, like, a palate cleanser or something, So that's a lot to be working on your own and then also, doing that. Wow. Yeah. That's amazing.
Again, I don't want to set myself up as some paragon. I was really lucky that however I'm constructed in emotional terms and cognitive terms, that the two jobs were something of a break from each other. Mm-hmm. And the writing the book, it was hard work as we've been discussing, but it was such a positive and therapeutic experience in other ways that I think that kind of energy really helped carry me through as well.
What about
was there?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No,
you go, Al.
Were there any, like, tricks that you were able to borrow from all the writers that you've worked with over the years?
I wouldn't, yes, I would say, although I can't say exactly what those tricks are. I think I've just osmosed the best aspects of my author's work. It's been I think I've just had this marvelous subconscious education over the course of my 30 years that I think helped me in ways that I can't articulate, but that I feel strongly. Scene setting, pacing, prosody. I mean, I work with some marvelous authors, and I'm very much of a sponge. I can look back at an email that I wrote, say, 7 years ago or 10 years ago, and I can give you a pretty good guess as to who I was editing at the time, because I'll take on aspects of their style. I'll sneak into an email. So I think whatever style that I have now is the distillation of every author I've ever worked with.
I still have a couple little notes of things you said to me on my little sticky notes. And I think my favorite was, because I just find it very comforting, was when you said that the easier it is to read, the harder it was to write.
Yeah, that's probably, I tell that to every single author. I told it to myself multiple times as I worked on this book, and I believe it strongly. I feel like authors in particular, and Alice, I'm honored that has a place in your among your sticky notes. I think one of the central illusions of much art is the illusion of artlessness. You look at it and it's so easy to take in, and you think, my 5-year-old could do that, or it must just fall off their fingers onto the keyboard and into my heart. And of course, we work so hard as an editor, and as an author. I worked very hard so that it's very easy to take in. But authors, I think, often become swept up in that fiction themselves. They read the greats, they read their favorites, and they think, my God, she's so good. It just feels so effortless. Why can't it be that way for me? And believe me, it is just as hard for her. She is having just as much trouble, or had just as much trouble, making it seem as trouble-free as it is, as you're having right now.
Yeah. And also, I think you can even succumb to that, when you're looking back at your own work, you spend 5 hours writing 2 paragraphs, and then you read it over and you're like, what's wrong with me? Why am I so slow? Why? Yeah.
Well, this is the same principle, I think, that allows people to have second children.
It's true.
There's sort of a useful amnesia,
So true. But I mean, obviously, it's so fun too. I mean, like you said, it was very cathartic. It sounds like, for you to work on the book. So as hard as the craft is, it's so rewarding. I do wonder, are you feeling nervous about the publicity side now? Because so you're in production. Do you have a pub date? Tell us what is happening.
So the pub date is April of 2025. We are. I'll get the copy edit back in probably a month or so. And I'll go through the process you folks know quite well. I'll, answer the copy editor's queries. I'll take in whatever the fact checker has found. We'll see first pass a few weeks later. We'll see second pass a few weeks after that. Meanwhile, the process of blurbage will commence. They'll start pitching it for publicity. We'll start thinking about angles, that kind of thing. I'm pretty good at, and I think this comes from my day job too. I'm pretty good at being in the moment and not thinking too far ahead about, holy shit, 7 months from now, I'm going to have to do X and Y and Z. I've never Z'd before. How am I going to Z? There'll be plenty of time to worry about Z then. If I'm anxious at all, I will say, I've had a few early readers who've responded really positively to it, to the book. I really hope it does well. I'd love to hit the list in Statlow style. But I will say I have a sense of mission about this subject. And the only thing that gives me, I think it's productive anxiety, but the only thing that gives me anxiety is, will I be able to do justice to this topic and help people?
Can I ask, do you worry about what your mom might think?
Well, I'm happy to report that my mom is dead.
Okay. Yes.
I will say I would have written the book if she was still alive. She died early in COVID. And I'll also say that, that's probably the best thing she ever did for me, was dying. Not giving birth to me, because if I hadn't been born, I wouldn't care. But even though I had been estranged from her for probably 8 or so years at that point, just having her out of the world was a huge relief. When we got the word that she had died, I heard first, and I called my sister and I told her, and she said, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." And it's that kind of thing, I think, might shake some people up, or make them feel like how disrespectful, how unkind to speak in such a way of anybody in the world. And I'm not a Buddhist, but I think of any spiritual practice, that's the one that's closest to my own thinking and feeling in general. And that doesn't feel very much like what the Buddha would advise. And yet, I think that, why should I hold in high regard the person who treated me the worst in the world? Getting that idea across, that very counterintuitive idea, and making the people who deserve to embrace it most feel like they can embrace it, that's the thing that I'm really, that's the thing that I hope to achieve. And I'm anxious about whether I'll achieve, but, I'm doing my damnedest.
I have a very close friend who's estranged from her mother in the same way, does not speak to her. And it's very painful. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about it in that way, because part of me is always a little sad about it for her, but maybe there's a reason not to feel that way. So I think it's very powerful.
Well, sadness is, go ahead, Alice.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, I feel like I have been reading a couple, maybe your book is coming at just the right time, because I feel like I think there was just like an Atlantic article about this parental estrangement. I feel like I've been hearing about it a little bit more. There's
been something of an uptick I've seen, and definitely on the socials, there's been an uptick too. Through no fault of my own, I do think that I hit the timing pretty well. To pick up on what Julie was saying about sadness, it is grief and guilt are the two most reliable results of making the decision to estrange. And I spend a good amount of time in the book talking about those two phenomena and helping readers through those two phenomena. They're inevitable. They're going to happen for a variety of reasons, that I talk about in the book. But there are ways to process them. The guilt is in almost in every instance unwarranted, but of course there's a huge thicket of misconceptions that are thrust upon us by society that make us feel guilty, and even by our peers, by our people who care about us. And then the grief is just inevitable. And also the grief is unlike any other kind of grief, because usually grief is about losing something that you had, losing a loved one, losing a relationship. This kind of grief is about something you never had. And there's a whole bunch of marvelous rituals in our culture for dealing with the first kind of grief. And there really isn't any sort of cultural support for the second time. And I think that's part of why people feel the way they do. And I hope that I'm able to offer a little bit of that kind of support that will help people feel a little bit better, like people like your friend Julie feel a little bit better. It really, really can be, and has been for me and a lot of the survivors I've talked to, ended up as a joyful experience. We've had to find our own path to joy until now because there's so little support, as I say, even in psychology and psychiatry. There is, I was really lucky with my therapist, but a lot of therapists don't really know how to handle this. And there's a prejudice in the professions in favor of reconciliation, which that's something I discovered after we sold the book. Digging in, I was like, oh, that's why I couldn't find anyone, over the course of 3 years to write a book on this subject that actually is sort of pro estrangement and here's how to tackle it.
Probably like a marriage counselor or something who they're sort of pro trying to make it work when maybe, you know what I mean? Right. It's like, that's interesting. That's what I thought is that, I will say that may be one of the ways to approach it. To my surprise, I couldn't really, I talked to a couple of very, gifted, couples counselors, and they were like, well, I guess you could apply some of the principles. So even they didn't see sort of a clear, or hadn't thought about a clear or direct path towards estrangement in the same way they might help their clients take the clearest path towards separation in a marriage. So important. The focus of the podcast is on the business side of books. So I do want to ask you if you wouldn't mind putting on your editor hat for a minute and talk to us about the business right now, like where you think things are. I know you said like for your book, you feel like you're hitting it at a good time. There's been a lot of talk. So. Yeah. Fingers crossed. But regardless, it's an important mission-driven book, as you said. But there's been a lot of talk, I know, just coming out of the publicity stuff recently about how, for instance, the list is very celebrity focused and, the big, Eric Larson, David Graham, those kind of books. Right. And so there's minimal room for newcomers. So I just wonder kind of how you see the industry right now, the market, I don't know, all of that, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not at all. This is a time of flux and change, as has been every time since I started in publishing. One of the things that I find, having been around for 30 years, is that the sky is falling, and it's always falling. It never fully falls, though, thank God. One of the things that I feel, by the way, I agree in broad terms with Julie, with what you just said about, the sort of, certainly the nonfiction list. I would say, though, that there are, it's interesting to see what endures. So I think the fact that that print books still carry as much of the market as they do, at the same time that audio publishing is booming, sort of skyrocketing, suggests to me that people still need. There are still big issues in the world, the kind of issues that take 80 or 90 or 100,000 words to really address. And enough people on some level realize that that's the case. I do think that the nonfiction list has a notable celebrity orientation these days. I don't know I'm not sure when it started, but let's say the last couple of years, probably. And there are some lists where the list that gets printed in the newspaper is the top 10. The list that we see in publishing 10 days before that Sunday it lands in the paper, that's 15. And we usually use those 15 titles as our assessment of what's going on in the list. And, some weeks, 7 of those titles are celebrity oriented. A couple of them are, right-wing screeds. And then it's sort of, some of them are brand names. and some of them become brand names. I think a great example is of the latter is Jeanette McCurdy. I'm Glad My Mom Died, which my colleague Sean Manning at Simon Schuster published. Now it's almost 2 years ago, and that book I think has been on the list. 96% of the time between then and now. And that was not a celebrity book when it came out. Jeanette McCurdy was a name familiar to some people. She had very good following on social, but, she, wasn't, atop the celebrity heap by any stretch. But she wrote something that the title sums that book up perfectly. She wrote a book that with a message summed up in the title that no one had heard before, and people flocked to it. A ton of people who don't follow her on social have read that book and passed it on, and probably even reread it. One of the things that I think about as an editor a lot is, I guess you could say, what's new. We think a lot, or especially because booksellers think this way, the bigger ones in particular, we think a lot about comp and when we're acquiring. And comp is competitive / comparable titles. And there are, pretty relatively strict guidelines of around what constitutes comp. You're looking for comp because you want to suggest that there are other books that are like this book that have done this kind of business, that have sold this many copies in these formats. And we think this book that's like those books could do the same. So, please order accordingly. That's, it's not a perfect method, but it's not a terrible method either. To help booksellers understand the potential of books that you're introducing to them, that the sales force is introducing to them. But the books that often really work the best are the ones that have no comp, and it's because there's nothing like them. And Jeanette's a great example of that. I did a book a few years ago called Too Much and Never Enough. And it was by Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump. Right. And she is, in addition to having the distinct displeasure of being his niece, she's also a clinical psychologist. So she was able to sort of assess Trump in a way that no one else had assessed before. And there had been a million jillion Trump books at that point, and there are about to be a million jillion more. And yet we thought, wow, no one's coming at it from this angle. And no one, aside from her last name, she doesn't really have a platform or anything like that, but she's really smart and she gives a fresh take on Trump. And this might be the Trump book that women buy, because that's the notable thing, is that most Trump books have been, whether pro or con, have been bought mostly by men, as far as we can tell. So even that was something that was kind of hard to comp. But it did really well. It did, something over 2 million copies in the end.
Wow.
Whoa.
That's amazing. So that's so when you're looking at acquiring, is that kind of what you're thinking about then? Because once I had an editor tell me, she always thinks about what will make someone reach for a book. There has to be some kind of connection or some reason why on a table of books they're going to reach for yours, so you have to have something there like that. I don't know. So I always keep that in my head, but I wonder what you think about,
I think about a lot of things, and it varies somewhat from project to project. But I'm not ducking the question. In fact, I'm going to say, here's all the things. One criterion I use is does this book present an idea in one sentence that grabs you, but that takes, again, let's say 80,000 words. That's a pretty standard length for a book these days, but takes but you have some sense that it's going to take 80,000 words to unpack it completely. Another way I say it to myself and I say to my authors is, does this book ask a question in one sentence that takes 80,000 words to answer? Mm. And another sort of a variant of what you just said is something I think of as the $25 test. Is someone actually going to pay $25 for this thing? It's, that's sort of a rough number. You can go on Amazon and get it for 20 or, something like that, depending on what promotion they're running at a given time. But basically, you could also call it the 12-hour test. Is someone going to spend 12 hours on this? In an era where that's a season and a half of your favorite streamer, and then a variant of that is what you might call the 1,000-hour test. Do I want to spend 1,000 hours on this? As an editor, with this person, with this idea. Something else I often think about is, we talked about complicness. And I don't eschew comps altogether, but I'm always open to the notion like, wow, there are no comps here. Why are there no comps? Maybe it's because it's boring, and or maybe it's because it like Jeanette's book, and maybe to a degree like my book, it dares to enter territory that no one has entered before, that other people will want to follow. The path, the pathfinder into. I also think about what can I bring to it as an editor. I'm not always turned off by gaps in a proposal. And as you folks know, most of the stuff we buy is based on proposal, and proposals are sort of like a grant proposal in academia, where you say, this is my intention, to explore this particular idea. Here's why the idea is worth exploring. Here's what I think I might conclude. It's a provisional conclusions, and here's how I might organize it. So when I'm reading a proposal and I find gaps in it, sometimes those gaps are like, well, that, we can't really publish a book that has that gap in it. And sometimes I think, oh, how can we fill that? How might we fill that gap? How might I help the author fill that gap? And, the genres that I tend to favor as an editor are current affairs, history, psychology, hard and soft science. I do a lot of psychology. I think part of why I felt I had the chops to write my book is because I was so steeped in psychology, not just as a patient, but as someone who had edited a bunch of prominent figures in that field, psychiatrists, psychologists, and so I can bring that knowledge, and also I talk to every potential author before I buy their book. Or before I, try to buy their book. And I'm looking to see if, I'm looking for a vibe, do we get on well together? It's not a perfect indication of what the relationship will be like, but no first date is. And, there is a bit of a first date. It's like, is this someone I want to spend a lot of time with?
It's so helpful to hear this perspective, actually. Don't you think, Alice? Hear it from the side,
Yeah. I was curious. We haven't talked a lot on this podcast about proposals. I think we've talked a lot about the writing of the book. But I'm curious, as someone who, you must read many, many proposals. Do you think that they're a good indication of what the book will ultimately be? How often because obviously when you're working on a proposal, you've done a certain amount of work, but you're doing it all in spec. So you're trying to figure out how to kind of, leave a little bit of room for intrigue, or letting the editor give you their ideas. while also having like a full sense of what it will be. Yeah, I don't know. I just wonder if you had any like words of wisdom about the art of the proposal.
Yeah, I mean, basically, my advice is write really good. I mean, I would say there are a few basics. I tend to think that a good length for a proposal. We can start there. I think a good length for a proposal is 50, maybe 75 double-spaced pages. And I think that those are the kind of books I do. And indeed, I think for most nonfiction, you want to have an outline, which says all the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It says why should there be a book on this topic? Why is this topic important? Why will people care about this topic? Why am I qualified to write about this topic? Why am I impassioned enough to write about this topic? And here's what I hope to, the help I hope to offer, the conclusions I hope to draw. It is provisional by necessity, of course, like a grant proposal. It is a description of work you haven't done yet, by and large. But a lot of what I'm looking for is an indication of whether the author's brain and heart are big enough to encompass the task ahead. So I'm thinking about I'm looking at their organizational skills. I'm looking at how good they are at pattern recognition. I'm looking at, again, can they write really good? That's something that is, obviously I help, my authors with the writing part. I do, I'm a very, as Alice probably remembers to her horror, I'm a pretty intense, intrusive line editor, although in Alice's case, not much of that was necessary because she's so good. But
you definitely did a lot of structural. I remember I remember when you had that breakthrough about like structure the whole thing.
Then that doesn't often happen with editors, obviously, right? That sometimes they're more hands off or big picture.
That's true. I will say there's this persistent myth of the death of editing. And to me, there's a very man bites dog quality to that. You hear it loudly from the authors who weren't edited properly, but you don't hear anything from the authors, nor do you need to hear anything except in the acknowledgments, perhaps, from the authors who weren't edited properly. I've been at 4 publishers now in my career, and almost all, I would say easily the majority, and I would say probably close to 90% of the editors I worked with were as concerned with structure, with what we call top editing and line editing, were as concerned with those things and worked just as hard on them through their nights and weekends as I did. So bullshit to the death of editing. Sorry, that was a little bit of an aside there, but I had to let my free play fly. To go back to the notion of proposal, I think you also want to have an annotated table of contents. This part, this book will have 4 parts. Part 1 will have, chapter 1 will do this, chapter 2 will do that, chapter 3 will do that. And basically you want to, again, show your vision and show that you have the organizational skills to figure out how to get from the beginning to the end. One of the things about our work is that we, generally speaking, in nonfiction, we're imposing linearity on something that, at least at first glance, seems nonlinear. Doesn't matter what topic it is. It seems really confusing and complicated, and what the hell is going on here? And people are looking to us to sort of clear away the underbrush, focus on the things that really are, again, pattern recognition, focus on the things that really matter. And I want to see evidence in the proposal that the author has the capacity for that. Even in the end, if in the end, subsequent research and reporting shows that the pattern that was initially identified is different from the actual one, the fact that you have the capacity and the desire to identify patterns is something I really want to see in a proposal. The other thing I would say is, and this is maybe more me than, specific to me than to editors in general, but I think it's useful. So I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it anyway. Every book that I publish, has an argument. It can be overt or it can be covert, but I want the author to be trying to convince me of something. I want them to try to be changing my mind. I feel if I haven't come away from a nonfiction book with my mind changed, I feel shortchanged. This medium is better than any other, I think, at changing people's minds. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. It's the nature of reading itself in cognitive and neurological as well as psychological terms. There's the amount of time you spend with the author. There's this feeling of a one-on-one conversation between you and the author, which itself is an illusion too, because all books are collaborative between the author and the editor and the author and early readers and all of that. But you want to have that sense of a one-on-one collaboration. So anyway, all of these things put together make a book potentially the most convincing thing that the piece of media that you can encounter. So I want my authors to be really engaged with that on some level, and not just because it gives the material passion and the energy that comes along with it, but also because argument is narrative. A good argument is well structured, and that really helps down the line when you're like, what do I put in? What do I leave out? I don't know. Well, if you're making an argument, then that helps you figure out what to leave out and figure out what to retain. The other thing I'd say about a proposal is, for me at least, I have found a couple of rubrics, I guess you'd call them, that when authors are struggling with a proposal or struggling to rewrite a proposal, or when I'm just reading a proposal, would it work as a syllabus for a course? If you were teaching a course on this subject, what's the first thing you teach people? What's the second thing you teach them the second week? What's the third thing you teach them? Anything that helps introduce a sequential arc to, again, a big, fluffy, multifarious topic is going to be really helpful. And there are other things too in organizational terms. Like concentric circles. If you're writing about whatever the topic is, it could be artificial intelligence. It could be people pleasing. I'm picking topics of recent books of my own that is to say, books that I've edited. You want those. You can say, how am I going to wrap my head around people pleasing, or AI for that matter? Concentric circles is, think about its effect on the individual first. Think about its effect on interpersonal relations, how you react with your family, your friends, and then open it out. How does it affect the community at large, and then ultimately the society as a whole? And you can also work it the other way. Certain books benefit from going outside in, but those are all in. All those notions are sort of at my elbow as I'm reading a proposal, and I'm pulling them out and applying them as whichever ones seem most applicable.
That's so, I feel like this is helpful probably to, even if we have any listeners who are not writers, I feel like it's just like about thinking and about thinking clearly and imposing, creating structure out of kind of messy life.
Reality.
Yeah. I also feel like it's like proposals, when they go well, are also, we complain about them because it's a lot of work, but it's like, it's also kind of can be an opportunity for the writer to figure out if they are actually invested enough in this topic just before they go and spend a year and a half.
Right, for 100. I think that's huge. That's part of why I like to see a proposal that's 50 or 60 or 70 pages long rather than one that's 20 or 30. I'm like, man, if you don't care enough to dig in and write 50 pages on this, why should I care enough to spend however many thousands of dollars and however many hours of my time to publish the thing? Now, there are definitely are exceptions to that rule. I've bought more than one book off a 12-page proposal. But as a rule of thumb, I think you're right. I want evidence of the author's willingness to be deeply invested in this.
I think it's also fairer to the author. I mean, to go into a book project without having a document like that is so overwhelming, and would feel. I mean, I would feel so scared that someone's giving me a bunch of money to do something that I haven't fully thought through. Yeah. So I feel like it's also sort of reassuring to the author that they can accomplish it. So yeah, I
totally agree. Basically, it should be for the author and for the editor. It should be a roadmap.
Yeah.
And why would you start any big trip without your GPS functional or, your Rand McNally, however old school you are. But why would you not start with some indication of this, the path to take on the journey ahead?
Well, Eamon, this has been so amazing. Wow. We're so grateful for you taking all this time to talk to us and give us your wisdom and your insights. And I don't know, I'm so excited to read your book, and I'm going to get off this right now and tell my friend about it, because I think she'll be so grateful that you're doing that work. So.
Well, I really appreciate that, Julie, and Alice, both. I got at least as much as I gave out of this conversation with you, great, smart people. Thanks for the kind words. The book is The Power of Parting, coming from Putnam in April 2025. Maybe you can even pre-order by the time this podcast drops.
Knowing our technical abilities, that might very well be true.
Podcast production only slightly faster than book production.
Well, whenever this comes out, I can't wait to hear it. It was so fun and enlightening to talk to both of you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of How Books Work. Join us on our next episode as we continue to explore publishing behind the scenes.